Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming. My name is Yusuf Mahmoud. I am a senior advisor here at IPI. Thank you for coming to this conversation around the launch of a new IPI report entitled A Process in Search of Peace: Lessons from Negotiating and Implementing the Inter-Malian Agreement, by Arthur Boutellis to my right and Marie-Joelle Zahar to my left. You can pick up copies of this report at the entrance of this room if you have not done already so. The report, as its name suggests, looks at the 2014-2015 negotiations and the implementation of the Agreement for Peace and Reconciliation in Mali, resulting from the Algiers peace process, otherwise called the Bamako Agreement. The report is fresh off the press, literally, and will also soon be available in French version. This is a very timely report, as today is the 2-year anniversary of the signature of the Bamako Agreement on 20 June 2015. And Mali, as many of you know, has been the focus of much attention lately in New York, as the Security Council discussed this past Friday the renewal of the mandate of MINUSMA and the possibility of blessing the deployment of a regional force by 5 Sahel countries called the G5 Sahel Force. IPI's mediation work until now has largely focused on the Middle East and UN-led peace processes. This report, together with the prior Colombia report, are the beginning of a new series shifting away from the Middle East and looking only at processes elsewhere, where the UN did not play a lead mediator role, but was called upon to support various parts of the process or implement specific provisions of the outcome agreements. And although the report is about the Mali peace process, you will note in the conclusion there are some lessons learned for the UN as a whole, as this is of particular interest to this audience. We are grateful to the Federal Republic of Germany for funding this research. It's now my pleasure to give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Issa Konfuru, Permanent Representative of Mali to the United Nations, to say a few words. And then afterwards, he will be followed by Mr. Thomas Schieb, Minister Plenipotentiary at the Permanent Mission of Germany at the United Nations. Ambassador, you have the floor, sir. If you will.
Thank you very much, IPI, for organizing this ceremony of mark of the report of, on the peace process in Mali. I would like to thank Germany for being part of it and funding this research. And special thanks to Arthur Boutellis and Ms. Marie-Joelle for being to Mali, seeing on the ground the reality of the situation, meeting the real actors of the peace process, and to be able to provide us with this report. I will make comments later, but in my introductory remark, I would like to thank each and everybody of you, the international community, the UN, France, all our friends in Africa, for being so supportive of the peace process in Mali. We have a peace deal for which we are fighting on a daily basis to bring peace to our population in the peaceful period. But the situation on the ground is difficult, tell you the truth. The peace process is in jeopardy human being traffickers are on the ground to do what they can to make sure that these process collapse. We have to remain committed to help Malian people, to help us to get out of this deep crisis. I know that on the political side, I mean, the implementation of these agreements, we have made some progress, real progress, I can tell you. But these criminal groups on the ground are doing everything they can to make sure there is no state. And if there is no state, I mean state authority, they will continue to do their criminal business. I think what's happening in Mali goes beyond Mali. Security situation is getting worse in the region, and our leaders have decided to deploy very soon a joint force to fight these terrorists and criminal groups on the ground. The Security Council is seized of the matter. We hope that very soon this resolution will pass and that very soon these troops will be deployed to fight this group and to create the environment for the quick implementation of a peace agreement to allow MINUSMA to perform and to save our population from being in a situation where they are. Sometimes they have a feeling that they are abandoned by not only the state, but also our partners. I have seen the report, at least the summary part of the report. I share some of the analyses contained in the report. I have a lot of comment on some of them. There are some of them, but I will have the opportunity to come back and share my own analysis or the analysis of the government about this aspect. We are concerned by the tension between the two signatory groups, which is platform and coordination, especially around Kidal. What I want people to know is that if the government, I mean, the state authority is weakened, we give power to the street. And when power goes to the street, in our case, the religions or the community will take over. This is the danger for the state. So let us work together to strengthen the state authority, to make sure that Mali has full authority in its full territory. You will see that human rights will be improved. You will see that we will be able to provide peace dividend to our communities. And you will see that the entire community fighting which is going on now will cease quickly. But as long as we continue to think that the government and signatory group will be on the same equality footing, it will be difficult to reach peace in our environment. So I'm going to stop here and once again thanking API for making this possible, and thank Boutellis again and Marie-Joelle for being part of this international effort to bring peace in Mali and in the region. I thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Ambassador Konfuru, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the German mission to the UN is pleased to co-host this event with the International Peace Institute to launch the report, A Process in Search of Peace, Lessons from Negotiating and Implementing the Inter-Malian Agreement. And I would like to congratulate the two authors for their report, Arthur Boutellis and Marie-Joelle Zahar. Just a couple of brief words from me. Crisis prevention is at the heart of the German foreign policy. Our policy recognizes that mediation is a key pillar of successful and sustainable conflict resolution. Lasting compromises can be found only through inclusive dialogue. Of course, exchanging positions, finding compromises, and reaching agreements all demand trust. Trust not only in each other, but also in the mediator. For this reason, Germany offers its good offices and its national and multilateral experiences whenever needed and requested, for example, in forgotten conflict regions such as Mozambique and Papua New Guinea, and in more prominent ones such as Libya and Syria. In many cases, the key to success is not immediate track one mediation, but rather long-term engagement. For example, we are pursuing such an approach in Yemen and Sudan by supporting their national dialogues. We believe that successful mediation demands long-term commitment and close cooperation with all relevant partners. A coherent and coordinated approach is essential. Duplicating efforts often does more harm than good and must be avoided. This is why we are happy to support DPA's Mediation Support Unit and its standby team. From 2015 to 16, we increased our funding from 1.5 to 4 million euro, and we are regularly hosting conferences and training sessions for members of the Mediation Support Unit in Germany. Altogether, Germany is supporting over 40 mediation projects with a budget of 44 million euro. Ladies and gentlemen, now, with the signing of the peace agreement in 2015, Mali was set on a path for peace. Mediation is at the very core of this challenging process. Since the security situation remains volatile, the peace process is by no means irreversible. But the alternatives to peaceful conflict resolution are simply intolerable, and all stakeholders must engage in constructive dialogue for the good of the Malian people. This is not an easy task due to the fragmentation of groups and their divergent political views and interests. Mistrust has been fed, and the speed of the implementation of the peace agreement has been slow. But the installation of interim authorities and joint patrols are a positive sign. We welcome the commitment of the parties involved, but believe even more progress is possible. Ladies and gentlemen, Germany remains committed to our friends and partners in Mali and in MINUSMA. We strongly believe that successful mediation can directly help the Malian people, as it allows for the return of state authority, provision of basic services, re-establishment of the rule of law, and a general improvement of the security situation. So we call on all parties to work together for a fast and effective implementation of the peace agreement. It is the only way to prevent a return to violence. And thank you once again, IPI, for organizing this very important event and the launch of this very important report. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you, Mr. Sheeb. And thank you for particularly those last words. There is no other alternative but to make it work, because that alternative is too scary to contemplate. Thank you very much. It's now my pleasure to give the floor to the authors of this report, Dr. Marie-Joelle Zahar, Senior Visiting Fellow at IPI and Professor at University of Montreal, to my left, and Arthur Boutellis, Director, Brian Urquhart Center for Peace Operation, also here at IPI. I must hasten to add that both of them were actively involved, both as advisors and participants in the Algeria peace process. So they are scholar practitioners, if you will, and therefore we look forward to their insights. I would like to start first with Marie-Joelle, and then I will give the floor to Arthur. Marie-Joelle will deal with the peace negotiation part of it, Arthur, the implementation of the peace agreement, and then I'll quickly go back to Marie-Joelle to share with us some of the lessons learned before I give the floor to Sam, who hopefully will be patiently waiting and not leave us in the meantime. Marie-Joelle, la parole est à vous.
Thank you, Youssef. I hope that dropping this did not make it dysfunctional. All right, so as Youssef very kindly mentioned in his introduction, both Arthur and I have had the privilege in our previous capacities to actually accompany the Algiers peace process. After the process, for different reasons, we went back to our initial, affiliations, and we saw the last 2 years unfold very much with concern because, as was said and repeated by a number of people until now, there is no other option but peace. So the report actually looks at the 2 years of implementation in light of the negotiations, trying to think about the way in which some of the challenges of the negotiation process may have actually affected and created challenges for implementation. So this is not intended as a scorecard. It is intended as an exercise in thinking about how our mediation practices, and in this case, of course, the UN was not in the lead, it was involved, but this is a very much more common kind of arrangement going forward. So how our mediation can actually learn from this to make sure that implementation of peace agreements is both easier and more sustainable. So without further ado, I'm going to very briefly raise 5 issues having to do with the negotiations, which, in our opinion, have actually impacted the implementation of the Bamako Agreement. The first has to do with the moment at which the process began. The process began with the Kidal May 2014 events, at a time when the then Prime Minister of Mali paid a visit to Kidal, which is a city in the north and the heart of this fourth, actually, wave of rebellion. And at a time when the Malian army and the armed groups fought a battle, of course, as is often the case, each holding the other responsible, but where the Malian armed forces, weakened, of course, by the 2012 crisis, weakened by a number of factors, were not able to actually prevail. And so we had a government which entered this process in a situation of asymmetry vis-à-vis the groups militarily on the ground, which, of course, is never necessarily the best way for a government to feel comfortable to make concessions or discuss issues. Furthermore, the armed groups were not cantoned at the moment when the negotiations began. And therefore, as I think Arthur will pick up, security was a constant problem during the negotiations as military engagements on the ground and changing and shifting balance of forces actually affected the willingness of the parties to really engage with the process. The second point is who was at the table. And the issue of the representativeness of the parties was an important stumbling block. On the one hand, there were a number of groups organized under what we will, the label of the coordination of armed groups, who had actually been actively fighting against the Malian state and demanding recognition for a territory that they call Azawad, so autonomy for their territory. On the other hand, there was a constellation of other groups that at the time of the beginning of the talks did not really have much military strength on the ground, but represented other communities of the north of Mali. Now, the belligerents considered that the other groups, the platform, did not have any business being at the table because they were not actively engaged in the fight. Of course, bringing the two groups was an effort to be inclusive and in many ways to respect the idea that was already spelled out in an earlier agreement which brought to an end the 2012 crisis, the Ouagadougou Preliminary Agreement, which demanded that the state of Mali have actually discussions, inclusive discussions, with all of the communities of the north with a view to finding a durable and sustainable peace. Unfortunately, this did not work out, and because the belligerents' problem was not solved, during the negotiations, the parties refused to sit together, and what we ended up having was two parallel tracks, a track where the government met with the platform and then would meet again separately with the coordination. And that created havoc in terms of a process. I will also briefly say that that also was a very limited understanding of inclusion, and that a lot of civil society groups communities were not represented, did not really feel part of that process, and that affected the implementation and created difficulties in terms of buy-in. How? I've already mentioned that the belligerence problem created two parallel tracks. Mostly these tracks were shuttle diplomacy, with the mediation, and I'll get back to what the mediation is, meeting separately with the parties. There was no real engagement between the parties, face-to-face, discussing the issues. Now, of course, that could be understandable from the perspective of the problems and obstacles that existed at the time. Unfortunately, what that meant was that none of the parties really felt ultimately like they owned the agreement. All of the parties, to a certain degree, felt like this agreement was not really theirs, that it was imposed upon them. That also was deepened by a diverging diagnostic over whether the problem in Mali is mostly a security problem or a political problem. And the differences over the focus on either security or politics meant that there were, from the beginning, disagreements on the sequencing of the talk, with particularly the coordination demanding that the political side, the institutional setup, be settled before addressing issues of security, justice, or development, and the government, the platform, and to a certain extent, the mediation, preferring going on parallel tracks. Now, where the talks happened in Algeria. And of course, Algeria has a long legacy of involvement in helping Malians hammer out peace agreements. As I said, this was the fourth such attempt, the third where Algeria had played a role, although it had played a more prominent role in 2006. Now, of course, Algeria's interest in the issue is very clear. There is a security interest, of course, because of the spread of terrorist groups in the Sahel, and Algeria has had its own experience, a very painful one, with terrorism. But Algeria was also interested in not having a Tuareg state, an independent Tuareg state, on its border with Mali. And so were a number of neighboring countries that also have their own Tuareg communities. The Algerians, however, as they did internally, were willing to concede that there were political, socio-economic grievances that needed to be addressed. This resulted in an attempt to actually bring together as many parties that are concerned about the Malian situation as possible. Algeria decided for the first time not to go it alone, invited neighboring countries and regional organizations which had already been involved in hammering out a previous agreement following the 2012 crisis into what we called a college of mediators. Now, that college of mediators had advantages, it had disadvantages. The advantage was that every one of the parties, and there were sometimes as many as 18 parties among the college of mediators, had ties and an understanding of different parts, different protagonists, and therefore could leverage that to help overcome obstacles. On the other hand, they all also had their own interests having to do with what was happening in Mali and how it reflected particularly on the region, but also on organizations. And therefore, what that also meant was that it was difficult to make sure that the mediation always spoke with one voice. And ultimately, during the negotiations, there was a sort of a triumvirate constituted of Algeria, the African Union, and MINUSMA that took the lead and basically was really the active college of mediators, with the others kind of hanging in the periphery. Now, finally, I would say that we need to also address the what, because for all of the reasons I've already suggested in terms of the process of the negotiations, the outcome was a framework agreement. It was very difficult to bring the parties to agree on details. And so in many ways, the agreement was large, aspirational. It had some really potentially fruitful ideas in it, but it also left a lot to be discussed, negotiated, clarified during implementation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Marie-Joelle, for this insightful account of the mediation process, the multiplication of parties, the multiplication of mediators, and the plus and minuses related to each of these factors, and the fact that what came out was a framework agreement rather than a peace agreement. Arthur, how did this affect the implementation? Must made it go very smoothly.
Well, Youssef, you know that the signing of the agreement is when peace is achieved, right? Actually, just back to two core ideas that that Marie-Joelle mentioned. First of all, the latest one and the one Youssef just mentioned. Because of this framework agreement notion, because consensus could not be reached, in many ways the implementation we knew would be the continuation of the negotiations in many ways and would not be a simple exercise indeed. The second thing is, and I'll put this caveat again, although Marie-Joelle mentioned it in introduction, our report is in no way meant to be a scorecard. We're not trying to say who did what or not. It is really meant to be a lessons learned or lessons identified report that looks at the links between the implementation and the negotiations and what lessons we can draw from this. Now, the report identifies basically 6 key challenges in the implementation, and I'll go through them fairly quickly. You'll see the report is fairly detailed, so I won't be able in this short presentation to capture the nuances of all of it, so I'll encourage you all to go to the report and when it'll be available in French as well. So the first of 6 challenges is the issue of the government's lead role in the implementation. The agreement, Bamako agreement, clearly put the onus for implementing the agreement on the government. But in practice, what has happened is that the implementation, again, because of the way the agreement was achieved, required active involvement of the mediation throughout, including through high-level ministerial meeting of the follow-up committee, the CSA, at different points to try to relaunch the implementation process. Part of the issues was a challenge with setting up the national structures that would lead the implementation at the government level. There's been some progress lately with the haut représentant structure, and that has been welcomed in different instances. But that was a slow start in terms of the implementation on the government side. The other challenge has been that there's been a focus, as there was during the negotiations actually, on the security and the political aspects of the agreements, and less so on the other parts of the agreements. There are a number of achievements and progress. We've heard already in the introductory remarks. There's a timeline in the report you'll see that kind of lists all the achievements, including, we heard already, the setting up of the MOC, first joint patrols in Gao, interim authorities, etc., etc. But a number of observers have remarked that sometimes some of the progress has been ticking the box rather than truly implementing some of the measures of the agreement. And one of the things that the armed groups have been complaining about is that some of those measures, and again, it's the armed groups, have been taken unilaterally by the government. The latest instance is actually this morning, where the Coordination issued a statement basically complaining that the Charte d'Entente, Charte Nationale, basically did not factor in some of their own concerns which they had expressed when commenting on an earlier version of the Charte. The second set of challenges is about the fragmentation and recomposition of armed groups. And again, in the report, we've try a difficult and risky exercise of drawing a map of the evolution of the armed groups. I'm sure some people will challenge that, but we decided that it was important to try. So there are some graphs about this. But what I want to focus on and what the report focuses on is the consequences of the fragmentation and recomposition of armed groups. Well, during the negotiation, and actually during the preliminary exploratory talks that Algeria had done prior to the launch of the negotiations, basically there was an achievement of having two coalitions of armed groups, as Marie-Joelle mentioned, the coordination and the platform. And thereafter, the position of the international mediation that in order not to encourage new groups to emerge, groups could only be considered as part of the peace process if they were associated with one or the other coalition. Okay, that position has always been clear. However, during the implementation, that has posed some challenge. As new groups emerged, even though most of the groups did indeed affiliate themselves with coordination and platform, everybody wanted a space in the various follow-up mechanisms, including the follow-up committee. That delayed by months the effective start of the work of the committee after the signing of the agreement. It delayed the setting up of the joint patrols, also the interim authorities, as there were negotiations every time between the armed groups within those coalitions as to whom would get the actual seats. Second consequences were the clashes between the armed groups, which have had all kinds of consequences and have delayed. These started during the negotiations, but have somewhat intensified at different points during the implementation process. And that has had all kinds of consequences, but one of the biggest consequences has been, in our opinion, that the government has distanced himself from, in some ways, the implementation of the agreement, arguing that it was actually the armed groups fighting each other, and the government was no longer a belligerent, as it was when the negotiations started. Third consequence, the armed groups focused often more on the community and individual perks in some ways than the peace dividends. And that's part of the rationale for the title of the report, A Process in Search of Peace. In some ways, some people have observed that there's been much more focus on the process than on the peace. So armed groups, especially in order not to be seen as spoilers, have always showed their commitment to the process. However, sometimes they've resisted progress in the process while showing commitment to the process. And I think this is, we see this case again in the difficulty in sort of starting the joint patrols and operationalizing the interim authorities in Kidal, for instance. Third set of challenges is what we call the clanization of the peace process. The splits, and that links to the splits in the armed groups. The recomposition and fragmentation of armed groups has led to increasingly more armed groups, but increasingly clan-based armed groups. The coalitions were representative of many different groups when the negotiations were happening. In the implementation, as the groups fragment, increasingly they're representing clans, and we're open to criticism on the use of the term. I mean, we didn't want to say ethnic because it's not really ethnic. It's really much more clan-based. And despite some temporary agreements at the local level, including the ANEFIS process, for those who know Mali, the power struggles between and within the clans have continued to stall the process. And that has played tensions between armed groups, but also between the communities. And there's a real risk, as we see now over the past few weeks with the latest clashes in the Kidal regions between the armed groups, but also between the communities, that there is a rise in inter-community violence, not unlike what had happened in the 1990s after the signing of the Pacte National. Fourth, the unspoken factors, in French, les non-dits. The ambassador in his opening remarks said a few words about. These are terrorism and the issue of trafficking, organized crime. The negotiations did not directly address these issues, but the ambition of the peace agreement was really to help draw the lines between what we call the compliant armed groups who would have signed and be part of the process and those who are outside, the terrorist groups and the criminal groups. However, the slow progress in implementing the agreement has not materialized in drawing the lines, and in many ways these lines remain very blurred between the compliant armed groups and the terrorist and criminal networks which of course presents challenges. And is increasingly, I think, presenting challenges, as with all the attention to the north and the peace agreement really dealing with the armed groups of the far north of Mali, let's say, the three regions, now 5 regions of northern Mali. Terrorist groups have spread to the center of Mali and even been able to act even all the way to Bamako, as we sadly saw again this past Sunday. In our report, we note that the approaches to date to dealing with these issues of terrorism and trafficking have been primarily securitized and militarized. And we sort of put on the table some of the issues that actually came out of the Conférence Nationale about whether negotiations could be possible. And we sort of relate the Malian debates about this, as there's been a Malian debate about whether negotiating with terrorists, so to speak, could be envisaged. The fifth set of challenges is the lack of peace dividends and societal buy-in. We call them the missing pieces of the implementation, and this is where implementation has been the slowest on the issues of developments and peace dividend. This has largely been attributed to the lack of presence, the limited presence of the state in northern Mali to basically reset basic services, and also the insecurity, which has led to a negative spiral with no lack of security leading lack of development programs. And as today is the World Refugee Day, also one big issue is the lack or very slow return of the refugees due to persisting insecurity in northern Mali. But also we note that the societal buy-in, both in the north but also in the south, has been in some ways lacking for different reasons that we explained. That said, latest polls on this show that the Malians as a whole remain generally supportive of the peace process. Sixth and last set of challenges, the difficult, and now I get to the international mediation, the difficult unity of action and purpose in the international community. As Marie-Joelle described, the international mediation team led by Algeria during the negotiations, and this was a novelty because past agreements had been led by Algeria, but solely. This time Algeria associated a number of other mediators, including the EU, the UN, and countries from the region. Well, the international mediation, who had actively supported the implementation through all the follow-up mechanisms and guarantees, in some ways has strengths and weaknesses. The strength of the College of Mediators is the fact that different mediators have leverage over different actors, and therefore have been able to use this during the negotiations and the implementation, but mainly during the negotiations, including to get the parties to effectively sign the agreement. And in addition to the College of Mediators, the US and France, members of the Council, were associated towards the end of the process in this endeavor. However, this unity of action has been difficult to maintain in the implementation, as there are different visions, as we heard, in terms of how to lead the implementation and how actively involved the international mediation should be in pushing and pulling, so to speak, the parties, versus a more hands-off approach that it's really national ownership and it's for the Malian themselves to implement, and the follow-up is just following up, suivi, rather than actively mediating during the implementation process. And there, maybe to finish on the issues of we've heard, the international community has been very involved and remain engaged on the side of Mali, but I think there's a question of how long this engagement will be sustained. Few of the regional mediators are left. Foreign Minister of Algeria, Lamamra, has been recently replaced. He was instrumental in getting the agreement. Will Algeria remain as involved as it has been until now? Will the international community, get tired at some point? All kinds of questions I think we ask as well.
Thank you, Arthur. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're still confusing peace agreement with peace, I hope you think again. In the best circumstances, peace agreement is a tentative, shaky covenant to move from violence to politics and continue politics or violence through other means. So what does it tell us now that we have heard the genesis of the peace process, the 6 challenges faced by the implementation of this framework agreement? So what can What does your report tell us about the main lessons we should draw from this experience?
Well, as I said at the beginning, in many ways, the kind of mediation that we've seen in Algiers is a harbinger of things to come. Increasingly, I think, we are moving away from processes with a single mediator and a single table. And therefore, in many ways, the process in Mali raises questions. I mean, we call them lessons, but I think, it's mostly questions that particularly the UN, but also other organizations wanting to get involved in mediation need to think about seriously. And so I'm going to briefly go over some of these and maybe stop at some which I think are particularly relevant for the UN. Well, the first for the UN, of course, is the fact that the UN is increasingly likely to find itself in a situation where, although it didn't have a lead in mediation and therefore may not have been able to shape an agreement the way it thinks it ought to be shaped, it ends up having de facto the lead in implementation. And because, of course, there is a UN mission, a stabilization integrated mission in Mali, and because that mission is very visible, the UN has been taking the lead in implementation, and in many ways, unlike other actors of the follow-up committee, has not had the luxury of basically sitting back. It has found itself in situations, particularly around security, where it has had to basically get involved. That, of course, puts the UN very much into focus. And what we all know is that there will always be those who think you do too much and those who think you do too little. And when we have an agreement like the Bamako Agreement, which leaves a lot to be clarified, differences in interpretation can create political uncertainty and can create political challenges for a mission implementing a Security Council mandate. This relates to the fact that in situations like these, the mission on the ground may have more than one principle, as we call them, that it has to be accountable to. Now, the UN mission, of course, is accountable to the Security Council for the implementation of its mandate. But to the extent that it is very much involved in the DDR and SSR processes, in the setting up of joint patrols, it is also a partner in the implementation of a part of the agreement that follows or that falls under the purview of at least the security part of the follow-up committee. And therefore, the UN finds itself having, to give, to basically give account of what it does and what it doesn't do to more than one master, if I may. The mission has more than one master, and that can create tensions when different masters pull you in different directions. Now, this has not yet happened fully in Mali, but the question of whether the mission, for example, should have a more or a less robust mandate could become a bone of contention between the various agents trying to push implementation. Now, of course, again, in many ways, given the size of this mission and the very disruptive presence that the arrival of a mission, even best intention, can have on the everyday life of a country, the mission in Bamako particularly has finally found its space. But missions remain dependent on the goodwill of the country. And ultimately, for it to be efficient, the mission needs to be able to actually work with the Malian authorities. Now, there was a point at which that was difficult, particularly when the mandate of the mission put it in an odd situation where, on the one hand, it needed to support the extension of state authority, where, as the ambassador said, this is something absolutely essential for the stability of a country, but at the same time, it wanted to support inclusive talks that various parties at the time, including the government, resisted for different reasons. And so the mission was, as we'd say in French, in porte-à-faux. So it was a bit pulled between two different positions. And that, by the way, is something that is likely to reoccur in the future, given a certain set of conditions. That set of conditions is not there now, but it is something that people need to think about, particularly in terms of the way in which missions relate to the authorities in situations as complicated as Mali, where the problem is not just a problem of internal political problems, but also more regional, transnational terrorist and trafficking problems, all of the non-dit. Now, of course, there are other lessons. The last one that I will highlight is the role of the UN as a norm entrepreneur. In many ways, it is the role of the UN to stand for a certain set of principles. And MINUSMA has done that both in Algiers and since the signing of the agreement in various reports that the Secretary General has issued on Mali and submitted to the Security Council. I will only highlight the issue of inclusivity. If the UN didn't talk about inclusivity, I don't think anyone would, in great part because given all the other challenges, that might seem like, a secondary or a marginal issue. But it is important to think about how you bring all parts of a society into a new compound, and that very much is what peace agreements are about. For them to be sustainable, they need to have the buy-in of society, not just of the elites. And much as this may sound a bit like a nagging exercise, what we found actually is that with all the Malians we talked to, whether in the government or in the armed groups or whatever, the UN's hammering of the issue of inclusivity has actually made it an issue that people now talk about of their own volition. Now, does that mean that tomorrow the process is going to be open to everyone in civil society? No, nor do I think that it necessarily should be the case. Processes sometimes need to bring some people on board at different points in time. But the fact of the matter is that in situations where the security issues are as daunting as Mali, we sometimes are tempted to take a very realpolitik approach to things and to push norms to the side. And the fact that the UN has not done that, I think, is something that will ultimately, in this case, and I would argue maybe in other cases as well, be to the benefit of the entire society.
Thank you, Marie-Joelle. So as you have noted, the quality of a peace agreement is only equal to the quality of its implementation. And as I was preparing for this moderation, I was looking over my notes when I was teaching mediation, and I found a very intriguing subtitle which says, "Can international peace mediation do harm?" And there was a big yes. And I have various notes under that. I'm not going to bore you with that. But there was an additional element that I found that is related to one aspect that Arthur shared with us, namely that when we look at the implementation patterns over a 10-year period of various peace agreements, the research suggests that provisions in agreements related to security and political issues tend to be implemented more robustly and a much faster pace than provisions related to social and economic reforms or human rights or minority rights. And that creates a different type of dynamics. So without further ado, thank you for your patience, Sam. You've been watching it from here. You've been dragged and pulled constantly back and forth. What is your take? And I'm going to be, as a former colleague, be even more stricter in terms of timing, because I'd like to give a little bit of time for the others.
Thank you, Youssef, and thank you, Marie-Joelle and Arthur, for an excellent report. I think for us it will be a guiding Bible for the next steps in the Malian peace process and certainly elsewhere in Africa. Maybe I'd like to, based on the 6 points that were just raised by Arthur, to just go back to a few points. First, on the lead role in the mediation, I think we should also look back at how this whole process started. When the resolution 2100 was adopted in 2013, creating MINUSMA, you would recall that the lead role in mediation was transferred by the Council from the region to the SRSG. And actually, it's a paradox to see that despite this, basically the lead role on the mediation escaped the control of the UN. Before that, it was a combined effort by ECOWAS, AU, UN. It had its own competitions within the mediation, but I must say that maybe it's a lesson also that we should draw. How far the Council should go in trying to impose the way forward when actually taking over a file in the context where the region has played an active role. I think that was probably one reason why the region was tempted actually to go back and ask Algeria to play a lead role in the mediation. The second comment I would like to make is about the ownership. I think, again there, in July of 2013, we had an elected government in Mali. And I think until, I think when we were discussing the renewal of the mandate last year, the government of Mali was adamant, and the ambassador is here, can testify, to see a little bit of rebalancing of the role of the government and the armed groups. I think one way was actually in 2295 address that element, to place the government as the centerpiece of the implementation of the peace agreement and really address this issue of the lack of ownership. Because if you look at the progress that was made after that, that's after 2295, this is when the haut représentant for the peace agreement was appointed by the president. This is now when we had under the lead of Algeria in February, this cadre permanent de concertation suggested for Bamako to see on a day-to-day how to resolve the contingencies, I mean the controversies on the peace agreement among the armed groups, I mean the signatory groups and the government. So I think those elements of ownership have been improved throughout Meredmi. Also, those are the lessons that we could draw in the future. Splinter groups. I think maybe there we can also do a little bit more analysis before engaging in the mediation. I think when you look at the Malian crisis, and I speak under the control of you, and who know this file much more than us, MNLA was a new kid on the block when it comes to the armed groups that were involved in the Malian crisis. Because over the past 30 years, all the armed groups and signatory groups of the peace agreement were the same. Actually, we would go from one crisis to the other and then dislocate and then defect and then join again the peace process. But in that case, MNLA was not really a well-known interlocutor. Bilal was coming from Libya, Najim was coming from Libya. So I think knowing those interlocutors probably would be critical also before engaging in the peace process and having that element. Because even when you look at the way the government was accused later on of favoring the platform against the MNLA, was probably the fact that the government knew better some of the elements of the platform versus not really being confident on having the trust that the MNLA would be part of the Malian peace process. Up to now, when you talk to Malian stakeholders, they still question whether MNLA would still go to this concept of Azawad or really play within the context of the integrity of the Malian peace process. So I think it's an element that could be looked into. Another element I would like to highlight is what Minister Lamamra called the ambiguïté constructive of the peace agreement. I think, indeed, this peace agreement was certainly left with a lot of unfinished business, if I may, or at least clarification to be made throughout the implementation process. And I must say that when we look at all the arrangements that were made over the past couple of years by the parties, they tended to depart quite a lot from the peace agreement itself. And somehow, how far can we depart from the peace agreement? Because on the one hand, you depart from the peace agreement on its provisions, but then on the modality of the implementation, you want to stick to having the two platform and CMA as the implementers. So I think either you address la lettre of the agreement and the structure of its implementation, or you stick to the agreement. But in fact, I think it would have been difficult to implement an agreement that was brokered 2-3 years ago without the realities of the ground. And I think one element also that has to be kept in mind is the fact that the situation changed significantly after May 2014. Especially in terms of, and the clashes that you referred to, Marie-Joelle, especially in terms of inclusivity. Because, correct me if I'm wrong, but the whole purpose of the Ouagadougou Agreement in June 2013 was to create the space for elections to be held, but also pave the way for a larger negotiation process involving the Communauté du Nord and not really being a kind of the war dividends that we have seen over the past 2 years, because we talk about peace dividends, but I mean, what we have currently is dividends of war, not dividends of peace. And we still see the process completely controlled by the signatory armed groups and not necessarily by those communities who represent the North. So I think a lot of hope is placed now in the Conférence d'Entente Nationale and the next steps. And certainly the chart is in question, but I think we're still hopeful that we can do more. I don't want to take too much, but I think too much time. But I would like also to highlight other elements. The fact that the conflict has been so stigmatized in the north of the country that we have eluded other aspects. The contagion to the center of Mali, where long-standing intercommunal tensions were there and unaddressed. And I think they have now fueled the conflict. And to some extent, when we look at the terrorists' focus, it's placed very much on this central region of Mali, much more than on the north. So certainly they're also seeing how early enough we can associate some groupes d'autodéfense in the peace process so as to avoid that their elements be recruited by terrorist armed groups to reverse the progress made on the peace process. Maybe that's a lesson that we can draw also when it comes to the Malian peace process. I think, I've touched pretty much on now the last point I would like to make is on the role of the unity of purpose of the mediation. Indeed, I think what we have seen is that Algeria has played a very important role by chairing not only the CSA but also the subcommittees of the CSA, and to some extent other countries in the region in the mediation could have played a more active role. If you go back to 2013, we had what was called the follow-up and support group of the peace process, the Groupe de Suivi et de Soutien, which was actually spearheaded by the African Union and which was dissolved, I think, conveniently by several stakeholders. However, the merit of this structure was really to bring together and be co-chaired by the UN, the AU, and ECOWAS. Currently, what we have is actually Algeria playing a lead role and other countries contributing efforts on the security, but not necessarily on the political front. And when we look at the point that Arthur was making, the need to broker a new anephis between the CMA and the platform, which is critical if we want to take this process forward. I think the role of other stakeholders, such as Niger, such as Burkina Faso, will have some stakes in the peace process and influence on the signatory groups would be quite critical. I think we need to see how the mediation can play a more collective political role in supporting the peace process. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sam, and thank you for picking up the difficult position governments can find themselves in. On the one hand, we want them to be held accountable for implementation, particularly if they have gone through a legitimation process, whether elections or other legitimation. On the other hand, we hold them as primus inter pares, and therefore equally responsible for what's not going well. And it's a very difficult position. The other one is the idea of a process and why process is far more important than peace, particularly when it comes to these elephants in the room, the non-deal, these terrorists, all the other for whom peace is dangerous, and therefore gain a lot from the cottage industry called war, rather than in processes where I've been involved. Process is very gainful, particularly for those who sit on implementation mechanism. There's a lot of per diem. There's a lot of money involved. So dragging it as long as possible, it's not bad. It's not bad. And so sometimes you find yourself subsidizing processes rather than rushing to the outcome and peace. Before I give the floor to our audience ambassador, would you like to say a few words? The microphone, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Youssef. Thank you very much, Arthur and Marie-Joelle, Samuel also for sharing their views on the peace process in Mali. I have few comments. The first one, I start with where you stopped. The difficult position in which the government finds itself now in the implementation of peace agreement.
Could you make it closer?
I can tell you that we are under pressure from all sides. The international community, the signatory parties, but many our public opinion. People don't understand. When you slow down to get the inclusivity in the implementation of the peace agreement, the international community, the report of the Secretary General, or our partner will finger point the government for doing less, for lack of will to implement the peace deal. When you speed up, some for inclusivity, some will say, no, we don't agree. The public opinion also has its view because the national ownership of the peace process is always not full yet. So we're in a difficult situation, and it's not shared by our partners. So you are not helping, and by doing so, you get the government more weakened vis-a-vis the populations. And if you do that, as I said in my previous comment, the power to lead the country will go to the street. This is the situation now in the country. The situation in the region is just like people feel abandoned by the state. Armed groups, criminal organizations are there to give them money, to put criminal ideology in their minds, and to create inter-community tensions because the state is not there. That's why we are fighting to get the UN help Mali to restore its authority. By doing so, you will end the violation of human rights which is going on the ground. By doing so, you will put an end to the free moving of the criminal group from one side to the other. By doing so, you will put in confidence the leaders, I'm talking about the military and political leaders of the armed group, to faithfully engage in the implementation of the agreement. You see, what's happening now? You don't have a clear line between terrorists and armed group, which has political demands. There is no clear line. We have discussion with them on a daily basis. In the night, they will pose bombs somewhere. They have no control on the groups, on the combatants. They are even asking the government to help them how quickly we can take the arms and make sure that they don't go to terrorist networks. So this is the challenge the government is facing now. Give us the ownership of the implementation and support this ownership. I think we have talked about something, let's talk about something today, the responsibility of the international community. You have commitment on their side. Mali is a poor country. We have all this engagement, provision in the peace deal. We don't have the resources, even if we have the political will to do so. The international community committed to give necessary resources and full support to the implementation of the peace agreement. But till now, we don't see anything. People just do this, do that, but there is no concrete action to help us do this. Do you think that Mali can do the DDR? We don't have the resources to do, even if we have the will. So let us be realistic, I think. We have put in the agreement schedule for the implementation of a provision. Everybody knew since the beginning that it was not realistic. But we wanted to have it. We said, okay. Now in the implementation, it's difficult. So let us be realistic. The peace process is in jeopardy, but we are still confident that we're going to be there. We need your support, please. We need your support. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have one speaker here, Mr. Ian Martin, and then let's see.
Ian Martin, Security Council report. Forgive me, Ambassador, if I go to the wider lessons rather than the current situation in Mali. I want to express great appreciation, more than usual, for this report, which is what I've been waiting to read without knowing that it was being written. And I want to urge IPI to go on and look at other processes in the same depth. You've done Colombia. I would urge Libya, if you're not doing it, around the Libyan political agreement. I would urge South Sudan. We really need to take this kind of look at, I'm sorry to say it, badly negotiated processes. This is really a question for Marie-Joelle. I mean,
the microphone a little bit closer.
Yeah, you make the point about multiple mediators. But doesn't Mali fall into another pattern we're seeing of imposition of agreements that are written by the international community and imposed, not mediated or facilitated by the international community? And again, think Libya, think South Sudan, and think in contrast Colombia, where a genuine process of negotiation between the Colombian actors with good facilitation produced an outcome that has a much better prospect of successful implementation. And I wondered too if you could do something, I don't think from a quick glance you do very much in the report, but Sam took you back to the Ouagadougou preliminary agreement. What happened? Why wasn't that taken on? That was, although it was ECOWAS facilitated, much more a genuine negotiation among the Malian actors. Why did the UN drop the ball? Was it, as you politely put it, because personalities matter? Was it because the UN was engaged in deploying a badly planned, premature peacekeeping operation rather than focusing on the politics of the situation, which would take me back to Hippo's primacy of politics?
Thank you, Ian. It looks like we have to start a whole new session for another 2 hours, but they are very pertinent questions. Thank you for posing them.
Shazia Rafi with Global Parliamentary Services, formerly Secretary General of Parliamentarians for Global Action. We worked with Mali, with the Parliament, as well as with the ECOWAS Parliament from 1999 to 2003 under a ECOWAS and Swedish SIDA project. I would like to ask actually all three speakers, in your experience, did you come across any role that both the Mali Parliament as well as the ECOWAS Parliament have played in these peace processes, implementation of these agreements? I mean, to some extent, that is what the role of Parliament, both on a national level and on a regional level, should be, to be involved in political power sharing and implementing these agreements. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Be happy to take one more question before I give it back to the panelist.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Idris from the mission.
Could you bring it closer
Idris
to
from
you?
the mission of Algeria, and I thank the whole briefer, Joelle, Archer, and Samuel for their briefings. I wanted just to say some comments. Actually, is it the first time that you did such a report, drawing some lessons from a process that is still going on? It seems that...
I'm sorry, what is your question again? Could you repeat it clearly?
Actually, I'm wondering about the topic chosen. We are drawing lessons from the process that it is still going on. Traditionally speaking, or practically speaking, we draw lessons from the experiences in the past. I was expecting, for example, that we will draw lessons from the crisis in 1996 or 2006 to improve it in the future. Unless we are expecting a new crisis in Mali, so we are drawing lessons now in order to improve, for example, to get another mediation in the future. This was my comments actually about the whole.
So it's too early to start drawing lessons now. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, this the point
Okay.
actually. I
Okay.
think the second comment is about the mediation. Actually, Samuel clarified this position, but I wanted just to remind everybody that in 2014, 2014, when we started the good negotiations, there were many actors claiming mediations, MINUSMA, Burkina Faso, in name of ECOWAS, and other actors in the region. So we didn't choose this what we call the collegial or college mediation. We used to be the only actor in this mediation, but this time it wasn't choice for Algeria. It was we found everybody interested in Mali, which is good actually. So we tried a new experiences, and we have tried to do our best. And just to comment on the what Arthur said about our minister Lamamra, is the Minister of Foreign Affairs. If we have a Minister of Foreign Affairs left, we have another minister. Algeria still were engaged and still engaged in the process of Mali. This is just a comment. Thank you for the briefings.
Thank you very much. Maybe I'll start with you, Marie-Joelle, and perhaps address the two questions that Ian asked, namely power mediation and what it says about the viability of the outcome and its implementation, and then also what happened to the Ouagadougou agreement.
With your permission, I'm going to leave part of that to Arthur,
Okay.
who was much more closely involved with the Ouagadougou agreement. I think, your point is very well.
And perhaps the gentleman from Algeria, the
yeah.
College of Mediation was imposed on Algeria, was not a matter of choice.
So let me start with Ian. I think your point is well taken, Ian. Increasingly, we do see agreements that are, let's say, not fully negotiated by the parties, and there's a variation in the extent of imposition. So, I would not use the term imposed in the same way for all of the agreements that you mentioned. Now, having said that, it also seems to me that what happened in Colombia benefited from very exceptional circumstances that allowed the Colombians to take time. Sometimes, and I think the ambassador has well pointed that out, you don't have the luxury of time, which I think, from the perspective of the academic, not the practitioner here, forces us to think about what's the happy medium. And the happy medium might very well be, a framework agreement with broad outlines, but where everything is not actually designed and specified, allowing the parties, as they negotiate its implementation, to adjust it and own it. So, in and by itself, I don't think that was the problem. I do, however, think that, Mali is in a, I won't say unique. I currently work supporting the Syria process. I've had my hands full with Libya at one point, so I don't want to talk about the uniqueness of Mali. But Mali is in a situation which is complicated because increasingly it's not just internal Malian issues which existed, but they're also being overlaid with transnational and regional issues that are complicating the search for a solution because, of course, that leads to a lot of background noise that needs to somehow be discussed, but is not discussed when people sit at a table. So, there's no way you can discuss, criminal traffic and terrorism at the table, although recently during the National Entente Conference, some people suggested that the Malian government ought to actually reach out to some of the long-standing actors who have now joined terrorists in an attempt to actually bring them back. Of course, we've seen such discussions with the Taliban in Afghanistan, so it's nothing new, but it speaks to the complexity. Now, having said that, and again, with all due respect, I do think, however, that the process was hurried for reasons that may have very little to do with Mali. Algeria was also under tremendous pressure because of what was happening in Libya and was concerned that things were happening on two fronts. And there were discussions about the need, to wrap the process quickly. to be able to move on to something else. Again, I think that also highlights the complexity and the need, as Algeria did, and I totally agree with you, to bring on board others. Algeria actually invited others to come in. When it started talking with the government of Mali back in January of 2014, these were bilateral discussions. Algeria could have gone the way it had in the 1990s and 2000 alone. Instead, I think cognizant of the situation and recognizing that the other groups, the other parties, the other interested outsiders could help, it brought them on board. So the point of the College of Mediators is not necessarily to say Algeria did something wrong. It's just that the more groups, the more actors come in, the more discordant voices and the more difficult it is to get everyone on the same line. And in this case, given how far apart, how complicated the positions of the various parties were, you needed a very united mediation to actually, to use a term, herd the cats. I mean, a lot of these groups had no interest being in Algiers and negotiating. And therefore, you really needed everyone to sing from the same song sheet. That happened for a moment, but that moment was quickly lost. Because of course, I mean, we're all here, involved in politics. We're not naive. There are, specific interests that come into play, and that sometimes, even when it would be to your best interest to work together, make it difficult to work together harmoniously. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Arthur?
Just picking up on the Ouagadougou, we do touch on this in the report, and yes, personality matters. Yes, the initial mandate that was mentioned of MINUSMA was unwieldy, playing both support to the restoration of state authority and being impartial mediator, which led some at the time to wonder whether a special envoy would have been useful in addition to the SRG. But the main reason was the fact that Ouagadougou was negotiated within a transition government of Mali. And even though there's a continuity of the state, as they say in French, I don't know what's the equivalent in English, and Ouagadougou said that inclusive negotiations should start within 60 days. In practice, the newly elected government did not see an interest and felt probably that in some ways the balance of power had already changed by then, and therefore did not feel compelled. And until the May 2014 clashes happened in Kidal, I think there was no real intention to go into this process. Actually, this issue of balance of power is interesting also for the Algiers process, because the government of Mali that entered the Algiers negotiations is very much in a different position, including because of all the clashes between the armed groups now, platform and coordination since, and which is also a challenge for implementation. Briefly on the issue of the parliament. So the parliament is actually quite involved, but the ambassador would be better placed to talk about it in the implementation on issues of the chart, the national chart, on the issue of the constitutional reform, etc., etc. However, what's maybe interesting to note here as we're looking back at the negotiations, maybe one of the weaknesses also of the process is, even though Algiers was dealt with in different phases, that in theory was supposed to allow the parties, both the Malian government and the two coalition of armed groups, to go back to their constituency and discuss. That was not really done during the process, and including, I recall vaguely, but there wasn't much during the negotiation themselves engagement with parliament and political opposition. I think since during the implementation there's been much more, but I'm looking at the ambassador to correct me if I'm wrong. Idris, briefly, the rationale for the report now, actually we were remarking before coming here that usually we write lessons learned when the peace agreement is signed. This time we held up 2 years to actually start looking at initial early lessons from early implementation. Indeed, to draw lessons also in the negotiations, which I think makes it more interesting. Also, we felt that the end of the interim period of 2 years was a good time. Of course, implementation is a much longer term process, and as implementation has been slow, and we're still mainly into interim measures and not in the bigger reforms. There could be a follow-on. Of course, on Minister Lamamra, I didn't mean to, it was just a question. I think one thing that struck us when we were last in Mali in May is the fact that most of the individuals that were active in the negotiations are now leaving or have left. And it's a new set of actors among all the international mediators. But also the fact that the Comité de suivi de l'accord, the CSA, the follow-up committee, is actually a very heavy structure. And there are a lot of questions about, how long should that remain? That can't remain for the whole duration of the implementation of the agreement. Might last another decade, right? So whether a lighter structure and discussions now about setting up the independent observer, whether that could be a lighter accompaniment structure down the road, that was more the spirit of the comments.
Thank you, Sam.
Yeah, very.
Ian mentioned that this is perhaps the beginning of the road of other studies and of other evaluation, where peace is wanted more eagerly by others, just to have agreement. And sometimes the outcome is dictated by exogenous and regional interests rather than by the actual. Is there room for additional studies of other peace agreements where the UN is involved in implementing, whether it is flawed or beautifully crafted?
I do think so. It's difficult for me to speak on behalf of the house across the street, but I think definitely. And I think Ian himself cited a few examples from South Sudan. I think DRC also can be added to this long list. But certainly in the context of Mali, actually, maybe to answer also Idris' concern, I think the positive element of this is that we also reach a stage where we are at a crossroad in this peace process, where we see that there's been some efforts, but there's also been significant delays in the implementation of the peace process. Now, how to make it more localized, how to ensure that the Malians start owning this process more actively, how to see, for example, the balance of roles between Algiers and MINUSMA in Bamako. We have a very active SRG on the ground who has some good offices responsibilities, who can actually play an active role in trying to mend the relationship between the signatory groups. I think this is more or less what we can also draw from as a lesson from this agreement. Because if we look at, to answer also the question that Ian asked on the why did we depart from the Ouagadougou agreement, I think there was, of course, the timing and the fact that the change of leadership in Bamako, but there was also the trust in the mediator that was designated by ECOWAS back in 2012. I think when ECOWAS designated Compaoré as the mediator, there was a lot of questions in the region, in West Africa and beyond. So I think, of course, on the first occasion, he was dismissed, also due to the relationship that, the blurry, sometimes relationship that Compaoré entertained with some groups, including Ansardine and others. They were in the open in Ouagadougou at that time. And I think the way Compaoré and Bassolé led the mediation also led to a number of questions that, of course, at some point discredited a little bit the way all of this was brokered. So maybe this exercise could have actually looked at the premises of it, but I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah?
Well, maybe a quick two-finger on that one, because I think another thing that one needs to acknowledge here is the fact that in the same way that there are questions about trust in the mediator of ECOWAS, there was a long history of trust in Algeria, and that needs to be acknowledged. Algeria had been involved. Algeria intimately knew the various parties, and therefore, at a time when Ouagadougou was having difficulties, and where, in spite of the efforts of the then MINUSMA SRSG, a lot of issues were blocked. Algeria came in and showed, for example, on the issue of release of prisoners and whatever, that it could deliver. And that makes a difference. it makes a difference to choose a mediator who is known to the parties, who actually has a history, and who has leverage. Now, the sources of leverage and whatever, that's, a discussion for academics later on. But that is something that needs to be acknowledged also. There was a constellation that I think, made Ouagadougou pretty much dead in the water after the presidential election in Mali.
This brings us to an end. Only we have 1 minute left. There are 3 takeaways that I get from this conversation. I'm sure each one of you will take away whatever you would like. Number 1, however flawed this peace process and the agreement it is, we are condemned to make it work. The alternative is too ugly to contemplate, particularly given all the other unholy actors that are proliferating religion. Number 2, we should be very clear about the ownership and the responsibility of the government. It's the only way to hold it accountable. It is very difficult to play cold and hot, depending on where you sit. Number 3, which has not been discussed much, but we have discussed it, Ian and I and other members of the Hippo report, to which we belong to that group that produced it. The region is willing and ready to get involved and organize themselves under the G5 Sahel. And they said, we're going to get it done and maybe bring you peace so you can keep it. So maybe this is an opportunity to test this hypothesis. But there should be an umbrella to hold them accountable for that action at the same time. This is not just a blank check to do what they want. So I hope to sort of echo the hope of the Perm Rep of Mali, that the Council take into consideration seriously this proposal before it. Please join me in thanking all our panelists for an excellent review.